Tamar, A Woman's Journey by Silka Chambers. This audio story, based on Genesis chapter 38, details the saga of a young woman who, tired of having all her choices made for her, embarks on a bold move of her own. Reflection. Tamar placed her hand over her belly and felt the expected nudge of a heel or elbow, maybe a knee. She looked up to make sure her mother or father weren't watching. Surely the pregnancy would be known soon, and then she would be able to stake her claim. She would get justice. She thought once again of her first husband, self-absorbed and brusque. 5 years ago he came here to her father's house to marry her. It was just a week after her 16th birthday. She didn't know anything, and was handsome in a coarse way, a warrior. So different from her sheep farming family. She was soon to taste the bitter gall of disappointment at the hand of a husband who ignored her and considered going to war more pleasant than associating with his new wife. Chapter 1. Birthday Surprise. Tamar overheard her father, Hira, speaking downstairs as she rose from her sleeping mat. Her younger sister was still asleep. "Bella," Tamar whispered, nudging the girl next to her. She pulled aside the thin linen cover. Bella turned over and shielded her eyes from the early morning light. The rooftop loft offered a pleasant sleeping space, catching cool breezes that drifted over the low wall at night. "Oh, it's getting hot already," Bella said. She began rolling the reed mat they slept on, chattering as she worked, and was stopped by her sister, holding up a finger. The muffled words of their father speaking to another man below caught Tamar's attention, and she thought she heard her name spoken a few times. What could they be saying about her? Since yesterday, when they celebrated her 16th birthday, her father had been reticent, her mother, Tola, somber. Could this be a conversation about her upcoming betrothal? Most of her friends got married in their 15th or 16th year, and her mother had given her that talk last night after the birthday feast. She didn't think it would be so soon. Bella finished rolling the mat and stepped toward the ladder. "Come on, I'm hungry." It would be better to know what was going on, so Tamar worked her dark brown hair into a quick braid and donned the headscarf she had set aside last night. She ran a comb through Bella's thick black locks. Bella could keep her head uncovered since, at 5 years younger than Tamar, she was still not mature. Smoothing the wrinkles from their gowns, she led the way down the ladder. Their father and another man sat on the thick wool rug in the eating space of the downstairs room. Tamar had seen her father's guest at other times, recognizing him as a sheep farmer he associated with. Today, however, he was attired in formal clothing and a headscarf encircled with a golden cord, not the working clothes of farmers. Tamar's mother, Tola, was entering through the back door, bringing fresh flatbread and her unique mixture of crushed figs and honey. When Tamar saw the clay vessel with the fig spread, she knew this was a special occasion. Tola set the food on the side table quickly and scurried out the back door. Tamar heard her sniffle as she left. Tamar stepped off the ladder and moved forward. The men stood, and her father's guest bowed to Tamar as she approached. "Tamar, this is Judah," Hira said. "He is the father of your future husband." He stepped back and allowed Judah to come nearer. Okay, good to meet you," Tamar said with a nod. Bella broke away from Tamar and bounced onto the rug, reaching for a wedge of fresh-baked flatbread. "Bella, your manners," Hira said. Bella returned, chastened, and remained hidden behind Tamar, who was still waiting for some word from Judah. Judah bowed again. "My son, wishes to find a wife. We live in Chezib, a day's journey south. We are sheep farmers, like your father. Except for he does other things. And he needs a wife." Judah stopped talking and looked to Tamar for some response. Tamar knew it wasn't up to her. Her destiny would always be determined by men. Her father, her husband, his father. "Okay, when do we leave?" she said. Why delay things? Since it was inevitable, may as well get on with it. Judah turned to look at Hira. She's a willing girl. Sometimes, Hira said. He stepped back to the rug and sat down. Come, let's all eat. Then we can talk about our wedding. Chapter 2. Marrying A week later, Tamar donned a new linen gown embroidered with thread dyed red from the madder plant. Her mother, Tola, had acquired the expensive thread years ago in anticipation of her daughter's weddings. She worked tirelessly the past few nights to embellish her oldest daughter's wedding gown. The fatted calf had been slaughtered, and 2 sheep as well, to provide for the wedding feast. Jars of wine were brought in and mounds of freshly baked bread. Tola borrowed clean carpets from the neighbors and spread them over the floor inside the house and out in the courtyard. She made several jars of the fig spread and other delicacies. Running out of food would be disastrous. They expected at least 30 guests who would be feasting with them all day. Tamar had washed herself and her hair that morning. After her mother brushed her hair 1,000 times, it was as sleek and thick as the tail of a king's horse. She then donned the resplendent gown and placed the golden tiara upon her headscarf, itself edged in red and gold. The tiara was borrowed from her aunt. It had been in the family for several generations and made a rich addition to her ensemble. Bella watched Tamar's preparations with excitement, touching everything, trying on the tiara for herself. It will be your turn soon enough, Tamar said. Try to enjoy being a child as long as you can. After Tamar was all ready, she helped Bella don her new for good dress, a made-over gown Tamar had grown out of. Bella's black locks tumbled over the deep green shoulders and bodice. She enjoyed twirling around the room, arms outstretched, to allow the long skirt to billow outward. After final preparations, Tola lowered the fine veil covering Tamar's face. And then they waited. It was late morning when Tamar's betrothed, tramped into the house, his boots shedding bits of mud and straw onto the clean rugs. His father, Judah, followed behind. They were greeted by Tamar's father, Hira. Her mother hurried to sweep the rugs clean again with a short straw broom. Tamar rose and stood before the men, her sister and mother remaining in the background. A sword dangled against leg, sheathed in an embossed leather scabbard. A large red gemstone in the sword's hilt caught Tamar's glance. Its beveled surface reflected rays of red light against the walls of the house. She gazed up at through her thin veil, and observed his wavy hair hanging carelessly over his bearded face. Swiped his hair out of his eyes with an abrupt movement and glanced at his father in front of him. Well, can we start? Excuse me, Tamar said, fixing her eyes on him. You are... spun to face her. Your husband, wife. My name is Tamar. Tamar said. That's it? Looked to his father for assistance, eyebrows raised. Judah tilted his head toward Tamar. Looking down at Tamar, he said, Yes, I am your husband. He raised his chin in a superior manner. Tamar sighed. It was the way with men to limit their words. Maybe he was shy around women. Maybe he just needed a gentle nudge. Giving an encouraging smile, Tamar grasped his hand and raised it before them, as she had seen her friends do at their weddings. The fathers tied a belt of white wool around their hands, stated the terms of the marriage, 30 ewes and a ram selected from her father's flock, and released their hands. They were married. As they stepped out of Tamar's parents' house, well-wishing neighbors tossed handfuls of wool which drifted onto the couple, ensuring fertility and happiness, but mostly fertility. Before the wedding feast, Tamar stepped to the private place behind their property to take care of personal needs. As she squatted, her mind was a tumble of thoughts about what just happened. This man is my husband? I'm married to someone who can barely put a sentence together? I am to be his partner, wife, lover? She took longer than needed, and after a few minutes heard a step come near, and Tola calling out, "Tamar, are you there?" Tamar cleaned herself and stood up. "I'm here, Mother." Tola held out a hand and gave a tenuous smile. "Your guests are waiting." At that moment, Tamar's heart broke. She rushed to her mother and grasped around her, holding on tightly. "Oh, Mother, who is this? I don't even know him, and I don't think he likes me." Tears streamed down her face, wetting her mother's shoulder. With effort, Tola peeled herself out of Tamar's grasp. She held her daughter out by her shoulders. Setting her face with a firm look, she said, "He is your husband. Go to him." She wiped Tamar's tears away, draped the veil over her face again, and clasped her hand. Tamar could feel her mother's hand tremble as it held hers. "I'm sorry," Tamar said in a small voice as they moved toward the house. "I didn't expect—" "Don't expect anything, my daughter. Your father-in-law, Judah, is a good man. He has been your father's friend for years. He will make sure—" her voice caught. "He will make sure takes care of you." Tamar and her mother entered their main space, now a banqueting room, to the cheers of all the guests, who were anxious to begin feasting. Tamar gave polite smiles and nods to them as she made her way around the group, all seated around the perimeter of the carpets. Reaching into the center, the guests helped themselves to trays of flatbread, platters of roasted meat, bowls of dipping sauce, and baskets of pastries. Lentil stew seasoned with garlic was distributed to all in small clay bowls, to be scooped up with wedges of bread. A wine steward poured for them all, filling cups as needed. Tamar took her place next to her groom, who was busy regaling the man next to him with a story of his conquest and battle, and how he beheaded not only a key military figure, but his horse as well, with one blow of his sword. Tamar touched Er's leg. He brushed her aside. She spoke. "Husband." "Hmm?" He barely turned his head to acknowledge her. "Are you getting enough food?" It was obvious he was, as he was at this point working his way through a leg of mutton, held aloft by the shin bone. But she didn't know what else to say to him. He turned his head more and gazed into her face, paused, and gave a single nod. He then returned his attention to the guests, spending the next hour telling stories of his time as a hired soldier for the Edomites, battling invading tribes, valiant stories with swords, axes, and lots of blood. Her husband was different from them, peace-loving sheep farmers. He was a fighter and traveled far to other lands to hire himself out for battles. It was earlier that year he came home and decided he needed a wife. Tamar let Bella sit in her lap, although she was much too old for such treatment. She snuggled her face into her little sister's thick black hair, inhaling her scent, hoping she would be back for a visit soon. Thinking of what that meant, that tomorrow she would wake up in a strange place, in the arms of a strange man, made her tear up suddenly, and she hid her face behind her sister while taking deep breaths to calm herself. Bella didn't notice. She was too busy listening, rapt to her new brother-in-law's stories. The next morning, Hira and Judah grasped each other's forearms as the new couple mounted their camels. Tola had already loaded her daughter down with the wool blankets and other household items she had been saving for her, and said her goodbyes last night. Tamar was glad there wouldn't be another tearful encounter today. Bella jumped up and down by Tamar's camel, which had already risen from its kneeling position. "I have to go now," Tamar said to Bella. "Help Mother with the cooking, and obey Father." She leaned down, treacherously close to falling from her mount, and added in a quiet voice, "But don't forget to have some of your own ideas." Bella nodded solemnly as Tamar situated herself more securely on the camel. Let's go, Tamar heard call out. He had already begun moving on. Judah rode behind him, and Tamar's camel was led by a servant who tugged at the lead rope to catch up. Tamar held on tight as she swayed in the seat and glanced back one more time to her father's house. A donkey burdened with her household items and the shepherds with the small flock of sheep, her dowry, were also part of the retinue. They exited the town to cheers of well-wishing neighbors who came to see the young couple off, and continued along a dirt track to the settlement in Chezib. Judah made conversation with Tamar on the journey to her new home. He described his family, his wife, Shua, and two more sons, Onan and Shelah. Onan lived in an adjoining property with his wife, and Shelah, the youngest, spent most of his time at the neighboring Zoab clan as an apprentice to a metalworker, learning to make sturdy farming implements for the barley and wheat harvests. Judah laughed as he said, "Seems in our family we can only have sons. My father had 12. He smiled kindly at Tamar. "I never had a daughter before." They reached the settlement as evening fell, and Tamar observed several generous tents neatly encircling a central cooking fire. Clusters of thorn trees lent a little shade outside the encampment. The stream they just passed provided water for cooking and washing, making a well unnecessary. Shua showed Tamar to the women's tent, where she herself and two maidservants also slept. Turning to her new mother-in-law, Tamar said, "Where is Er's tent? I mean—" "He stays with the hired men," Shua said. "Doesn't need any his own place. He's never here long enough anyway. Why, isn't this good enough for you?" It's fine," Tamar said, placing her small wooden chest of belongings at the head of the mat Shua had indicated. Not wanting to say any more about it, Tamar dropped the subject. Her parents always shared a sleeping mat in their own private room. Living in tents must be different from living in town, Tamar thought. After all, Shua isn't sleeping with her husband Judah either. Would ever come for her? He had disappeared as soon as the camels were led away to be watered. Perhaps he would say something to her at the morning meal tomorrow. By the time Tamar awoke the next day and exited the tent to join the others for breakfast, the men had already eaten and were working out in the fields with the flocks of sheep. Shua gave Tamar a disdainful look as she dished up a bowl of gray porridge and plunked it down on the bench next to her. "Nice of you to get up," Shua said, sneering. "Around here we all work from sunup to sundown. I warned my husband about getting a city girl for our son to wife. Don't know what hard work is, do you?" Before Tamar could think of a suitable response, Shua snatched up the dirty dishes and stomped into the food tent to begin the washing. Tamar's bitter tears mixed with the gruel, and she set the bowl down, not being able to stomach it. She dabbed at her eyes with the skirt of her frock and let out a heavy sigh. It's true, she didn't work very hard at home. Her mother did most of the housework, and just in the last year tried to teach Tamar a thing or two to prepare her for domestic life. But she was not unwilling to work, and would just have to prove her mother-in-law wrong on that point. Resolute, she rose from the bench, scooped her gruel into the crackling fire, and strode to the food tent, shoulders squared. Supper that night was a happier affair. The shepherds, maidservants, and other hired help joined the family around the cooking fire to sup on hearty stew and bread. Judah, next to Tamar, said, "I hope you are getting used to us." She smiled at him and appreciated his kind expression. "I'm sure I will. I'm doing my best with Mother Shua." Judah turned his head from side to side. "Good luck with that." Tamar enjoyed watching joke with the other workers and down large portions of food. They obviously shared a camaraderie from sweating together in the pasture lands and fields. She hoped he would notice her and say something. One of the shepherds, a grizzled man with missing teeth, gazed across the fire at her. Elbowing he said, That your new wife?" Gazed at Tamar, shadows beneath his eyes deepening in the firelight. Head tilted downward, Tamar glanced up at him and swept a lock of hair around her ear. The flames of the campfire glowed on her face, flushed from a day of constant work. She blinked her eyes and waited. His eyes fixed on her, swiped his sleeve across his mouth and rose from the bench. He stepped around the fire and stopped in front of Tamar. Still looking at her, he said, "Yes, she's my wife." Reaching for her arm, he tugged her to a stand and began walking away from the group. As she followed him, she heard the whoops and encouraging remarks of the other men. They entered the men's sleeping tent, empty for now as the rest of the men were still eating. Threw off his cloak and got down on his sleeping mat. Having been prompted by her mother on what to do, Tamar joined him there. It was over in a few minutes, thankfully. Tamar bit her lower lip to endure the pressure and pain, and then it was over. Wrapped his arms around her body afterward and slept. Tamar relaxed back into the muscled chest and torso, feeling a mixture of emotions. Attraction to this brawny husband of hers, his arms around her strong and hairy, and relief at finally becoming a woman. To be honest, she also felt a twinge of disappointment. The gleeful talks she and her friends used to have, wondering what it would be like, the married ones giving sage advice and a little too much information, did not prepare Tamar for the letdown she felt at the entire experience. It was painful and bloody, not at all enjoyable, but this is the way to conceive children, so she would have to bear it. Hearing voices and laughing coming through the darkness, Tamar realized the rest of the men were on their way back from supper. She hurriedly shoved her balled-up shoulder wrap up between her legs and slid from arms. Finding a handy opening in the tent, she slunk out into the night. After a trip to the creek for a wash, she made her way to the women's tent and slept deeply. The following days, Tamar continued trying to endear herself to her new mother-in-law by helping with chores and making small talk, but Shua wouldn't have it. She was a squarely built woman with large knuckly hands who could shape 10 loaves of bread before Tamar had the flat stones heated enough to cook them. She had no time for friendliness. Judar, Tamar's advocate, gave her warm, encouraging smiles whenever he saw her. Kept busy with his father's flocks and came home in the evenings, sweaty and smelling of sheep and mud. His main interest at that time was eating the hearty meals his mother prepared for the family. Then he would crawl into the men's tent to sleep. Occasionally, he took Tamar to his bed when the urge came. Keeping busy was a problem for Tamar. Shua had her own system in the food tent with a few trusted servants and rebuffed Tamar's offers of help. Tamar spent some time at sleeping mat, mending his clothes and tidying up the space, ensuring the fleece he slept on was straightened and the blankets folded for his return. Did he notice her ministrations? She never knew, but it was her duty as his wife. Additionally, she felt closer to him while handling the clothes that had touched his skin, airing out the bed that smelled of him. What else could she do to win his affection? Perhaps a special treat when he came in from the fields would entice him and emphasize her value as his wife. One afternoon, when Shua was out somewhere else, Tamar entered the food tent and combined a paste of pulverized figs with some of the honey she brought from home. She wanted to make the special spread that her mother taught her to make. Maybe would like it. As she was transferring the spread to an earthenware jar, Shua entered the tent. "What's that?" Shua asked. It's figs mixed with honey to spread on bread. My mother used to make it. It's for He won't like that." Tamar faltered. "I think he might." "No. How do you know what he likes?" Tamar didn't, really. Habitually wolfed down his meals when coming in from the fields, barely tasting anything, wisecracking with the shepherds. And she had never seen him eat anything sweet, like honey or dates, just the substantial stews and porridges Shua made. "It's just something special I wanted to make for him," Tamar said. "Maybe he'll like it." Shua trudged out of the food tent. Came home soon after and entered the cooking tent. He found Tamar finishing the mixture. She quickly applied it to a wedge of flatbread and handed it to him. He folded it in half and placed the whole piece into his mouth and swallowed. Then he turned to leave. "Hey!" Tamar called out. He turned back, eyebrows raised. "Did you like it?" "What, the bread? I always like bread." "No, what I put on the bread." "What was it?" Asked. "You liked it then," Tamar said. "It's figs with honey and just a little crushed mint." "Didn't taste it." He stepped out of the tent and called out, "Mother, where's supper?" Tamar rubbed her eyes. "I will not cry, I will not cry." She dipped a finger into the fig spread and tasted it. Sucking on her finger, she decided if no one else wanted it, she would save it for herself. She covered the jar of fig spread with a round of leather, tied it on tightly, and took it to the sleeping tent, where she placed it into her wooden chest behind her rolled mat. She took comfort in nibbling it at night before going to sleep. It reminded her of a happier time, a time when she was loved and appreciated. It reminded her of home. The following year, got restless with sheep farming and decided to go south to Edom during the dry season. His friendship with clan leaders usually got him into the thick of skirmishes over land or grazing rights. After spending the day sharpening and polishing his sword, he slept with Tamar a last night before leaving. She finished her monthly about a week ago, and hoped this, one of few times he took her to his bed, may create in her a child, something to relieve the loneliness in her life, someone to love that would also love her. Tamar turned to bumping against the sword he always slept with. Touching the luminescent red stone on the sword's hilt, she played little circles on it with her fingertip and said, "Perhaps I will be with child when you come back, husband." Would that please you?" "Leave that alone," he said, snatching up his sword and turning his back to Tamar. After a few moments, regular raspy breathing revealed she wouldn't get an answer. No surprise, that. Tamar woke with a start to the songs of early morning birds. Not finding her husband next to her, she darted across the tent, hurtling over 2 sleeping forms on her way to the tent opening. The night was just giving way to dawn, with a pale line of light on the horizon. Shua was there before the cooking fire. It was obvious someone had just had a meal. Tamar moved a bowl aside and sat down on the bench. "Time you came," Shua said. "Couldn't even see your husband off." Tamar squeezed her eyes shut. "I didn't know. He didn't wake me." She opened her eyes and then noticed Judah sitting there, on the other side of the fire. "It's okay, daughter," Judah said. "He'll be all the more happy to see you when he comes back. Being away will make his desire increase." Tamar went to the women's tent and rolled out her sleeping mat. It was still too early to be up, no matter what Shua thought. She fought off bitter tears. Why didn't like her? What else should she have done to win his affection? And when would Shua finally accept her as her eldest son's wife? If it wasn't for Judah's kindness, she would certainly have despaired of anyone speaking a tender word to her. She would just have to try harder. When came back from war, he would be anxious to see her. Maybe she should learn to cook meals like Shua cooked, or embroider her headscarf to make herself look prettier. She just wasn't sure how to win him over, but she would have to try. Despite her destiny having been chosen by men, her father, father-in-law, and husband, she could take it upon herself to resolve to be better, learn new skills, and improve her situation. During the remainder of the dry season, Tamar paid strict attention to Shua's cooking and helped her in the food tent whenever she could and whenever Shua let her. By and by, Shua became used to her participating in meal prep and gave her simple tasks to do, such as chopping vegetables or grinding barley. A few months later, at the start of the rainy season, a group of men mounted on camels appeared at Judah's encampment in Chezib. They stopped at the edge of the settlement, near the men's tent. Tamar was seated beneath an awning at the grinding stone, pulverizing barley into a fine powder. She looked up to observe Judah greet the caravan, and watched him talk to the men, who had dismounted from their camels. She watched the leader of the group hold out a sword on the flat of his hands. She saw the large red stone in the hilt glint in the sunshine. Tamar's mind flashed with visions of hefting that sword, sharpening it, cherishing it, sleeping with it. He would never be away from it unless— No! Forgetting all decorum, she lifted her skirt and raced to her father-in-law's side. Judah caught her as she collapsed at his feet, grasping at the sword he clutched in his hands. "Daughter, he won't." She looked up at him. Her voice gave a heave as she said, "I know, Father, I know." Death caused a pall of melancholy to hang over the settlement. Tamar found it hard to mourn, however. Despite first feeling distraught at the knowledge of her husband's death, she honestly didn't miss him. He had been away for several months already, and even when living with her, he paid her so little attention, she didn't feel the loss of him as of a close companion. And she was tired of being Shua's kitchen maid just to learn to cook the meals he liked. Tamar's primary feeling was relief. She would be able to go back home to her father and mother in their hometown of Imnah. She could live as a widow for a time, and maybe find a husband at a later date. Someone older who had perhaps lost a spouse as well. Maybe someone with a child in need of a mother. Nonetheless, to avoid the misery displeasing Shua would bring, she grieved. She dressed in coarse cloth and rubbed sand in her hair. The charade lasted the 2 weeks it took to retrieve bones from the land of Edom and bury them among the tamarisk trees at the edge of the property. Sleep evaded Tamar that night, excited at the prospect of moving back home. She hoped now that it had been 2 weeks, and had been properly buried, she would be able to bring it up. She slid quietly out of the women's tent and made her way to the benches around the still glowing cooking fire in the middle of the encampment. As she sat before it in the darkness, she made a mental list of the items she would take with her when she left. There had been a break in the rainy weather, and it would be an opportune time to travel. A few moments later, Judah appeared. He stood by the fire ring and regarded Tamar. "Daughter?" Tamar nodded. "I have been wakeful many nights since died," Judah said, his voice catching. He swallowed, gazing into the embers. After a moment, he said, "He was my firstborn." Tamar reached up and placed a hand on his forearm, nodding. He sat down next to her. "I couldn't sleep either, Father, and I'm glad to see you here. There's something I wanted to talk to you about." "Me too. Something we must discuss," Judah said. Tamar raised an eyebrow. "Okay, you first." Death." He stopped. Picking up a stick, he stirred the embers, bringing the flames to life. Clearing his throat, he said, "Death left him without an heir, unless—" He nodded toward Tamar, glancing at her middle. She touched her belly and shook her head. "Right. Then, as you know, my next son, Onan, has the responsibility to raise up to his brother an heir, a successor to his property and land." Tamar was confused. "How does that work? Onan took a wife shortly before she came here, and they don't have children yet. Did that mean their first child would be considered successor?" "He will take you as his second wife at the next full moon," Judah said. Tamar's heart fell. Judah placed a hand behind her shoulder. "I'm so glad this will enable you to remain with us." Tamar smiled a weak smile, trying her best to be pleased with this news given her by the only family member who had shown her any kindness. She crept back to her sleeping mat, her heart a stone. Once again, men were making decisions for her, and she had nothing to say about it. How was she to know there was this provision for men who died without an heir? Bad enough she was married to a man who didn't care for her. Now she was to be the second wife. Bile rose in her throat, and bitter tears threatened. Swallowing hard, she curled beneath her wool blanket and wept in secret. Chapter 3. The Second Brother. Tamar's second marriage occurred without much ceremony. Onan came to dinner without his other wife and sat next to Tamar in the cooking tent. The rains had returned, which meant meals were taken under shelter. Shua made an extra-large pot of her tasteless stew. Tamar kept busy all day making flatbread. The others who made up the household, shepherds and servants, crowded in and shared the meal. After finishing his portion, Onan sat back and patted his round belly. He turned to Tamar. I hope you ate enough." Tamar glanced sideways at him. Thank you. I had—" "Onan!" shrieked Shua. He looked at his mother in alarm. "Look at your tunic! Didn't that wife of yours give you something clean to wear before you came?" Tamar looked at Onan, who was turning red in the face. He was stuttering something to his mother. It was clean. My camel rubbed against me when I got here." He was unsuccessfully swiping at a splotch of dirt on the tunic. He had had his robe pulled over the area when he arrived, but after eating, he let it fall open. Tamar moistened her napkin in her water cup and lent a hand. Onan sat, arms outspread, like a child allowing itself to be cleaned up. "There, better," she said, smiling. She felt sorry for the way Shua called attention to the flaw in front of everyone. Onan slunk down, trying to keep himself from being a target again. Judah cleared his throat. "Are you expecting a prosperous lambing this year, son?" Glad for the change in subject, Onan gave his father an account of how many sheep had been bred and the estimate of lambs expected next spring. After the meal, Tamar hurriedly gathered a few last things and strode to the perimeter of the encampment with Onan. Most of her belongings had been packed on 2 donkeys earlier that day and had already been taken to Onan's settlement. A camel was kneeling near the tent. Onan helped Tamar settle in the saddle. He grasped the lead rope and started toward his small settlement beyond his father's pastures. Tamar glanced down the lean body of the camel to her new husband out in front. Short and stocky, he had the same build as Shua. His hair reminded her of however, thick and unruly. The thought of him made her throat tighten. She wished she had been given more time to try to make a success of that marriage. 1.5 years was not enough. "Comfortable enough up there?" Onan asked, breaking into her thoughts. Tamar smiled down at him. "Yes, thank you." This marriage might be better. At least he paid attention to her well-being. The full moon rose and shone on the gentle hills of the region, illuminating the final portion of the journey north. The clouds had parted, and Tamar shrugged off the extra cloak she wore against the rain. As Tamar approached his tents, he bade the camel kneel, helped Tamar dismount, and instructed a servant on where to store her belongings. Having been told nothing of the other wife, Tamar didn't know what to expect as they entered the women's tent. Onan gently woke a young woman sleeping on a fleece mattress near the tent opening. "Lena," he nudged her shoulder. She turned and gave him a sleepy smile. I brought Tamar, like I told you." Lena dragged a hand from under the cover and pointed to a place across the tent, next to another sleeping woman. She then rolled over and closed her eyes. Onan grasped Tamar's wrist and led her to the indicated spot. "Here, you can sleep here." Tamar gazed down at the hard reed sleeping mat. A thin scrap of cloth lay folded on it. "Can I have the blanket I brought?" she whispered. Onan glanced at his sleeping wife and gave an impatient gesture. "Tomorrow," he said, and left the tent. The weeks that followed were without any defining incidents. Rain poured down on the settlement most days, watering the pastures and barley fields. It would be a plentiful year. Tamar kept busy, often helping Lena with household duties or personal tasks, such as braiding her hair, mending her clothes, or making up the beds. Hoping to curry favor with the first wife, she complied, being glad to have something to do. Lena spent her time sitting on her soft mattress, working on embroidery or filing her nails. Karma, the cook, also inhabited their tent. She fed them inventive meals seasoned with herbs and garlic. Tamar showed her how to make the fig spread, and to her delight it was well received. Caravans that passed the settlement in the area often had the honey that was needed, and figs and mint grew nearby. Onan drew Tamar into his tent occasionally, gently waking her from sleep in the middle of the night, and then insisting she return to the women's tent before sunrise. He was a tentative, apologetic lover. Their times together were nothing like the robust, energetic lovemaking by her first husband, and it was so infrequent she was not surprised when, by the next dry season, she was still not with child. Other than those times, Onan paid little attention to Tamar. Usually seated next to Lena at mealtimes, he habitually ordered Tamar to fetch Lena another cup of water or more bread, treating her more like a servant than a wife. It rankled, especially when she saw Onan place a fleece cushion at Lena's mealtime spot so that she could be comfortable, complimenting her on her appearance and giving her little presents like lengths of fabric or little ornaments to put in her hair. Shortly after the barley harvest, Tamar mentioned to Karma that it was her 18th birthday. "We must celebrate," Karma said. "When I was growing up, our family always celebrated birthdays. I have just the thing." Tamar smiled in anticipation of the treat while repairing a tear in Lena's blanket. It was a finely woven throw of linen, the perfect weight for hot summer nights. Repairing it was tedious, however, and required weaving similarly colored linen thread into the tear. Tamar spent all afternoon at the task, and was pleased when, in the end, the rent was barely noticeable. Before supper, Lena drifted into the tent, and seeing the job was completed, peered closely at Tamar's work. I can still see it." She dropped the throw onto her mattress and turned to Tamar. "Since you're done with that, why don't you—" She looked around. Picking up her embroidery work basket, she thrust it at Tamar. "Here, you can untangle all these threads. I just can't seem to do it." Tamar didn't reach for the work basket Lena held out. Instead, she said, "You know, today is my birthday. Karma was going to make me a surprise at supper." "For you? I don't know why," Lena said. Placing the work basket onto her mattress, she sat down next to it. She pulled a fragment of seashell out of her cosmetics bag and began filing her nails on its rough surface. Tamar sat on the rug and picked through the embroidery, pulling at a bright yellow thread. She began winding it around her fingers. Finished filing her nails, Lena buffed them to a high gloss with a tiny square of wool felt. "Can I try that?" Tamar said, placing the roll of yellow thread into the basket. "Whatever for?" Lena chuckled and shook her head, tossing the felt square at Tamar. "Keep it for your birthday." She stood up, stretched her arms, and ambled to the tent opening. "See you at supper." Tamar finished winding the embroidery threads and then washed up for supper. She took a few moments to buff her nails with the wool felt and combed her hair smooth. Donning her nice headscarf, she joined the others in the food tent. Seating herself beside the others, Tamar caught the gleam in Karma's eye. After the meal of barley stew flavored with rosemary and bits of lamb, she produced the special birthday treat. "Oh, the fig spread," Tamar said, receiving the clay pot of the mixture into eager hands. "A prosperous birthday," Karma said to Tamar with a pat on the head. Lena smirked. Onan said, "Birthday? Whose birthday?" Tamar smiled at him. Mine. She applied the fig spread onto a bit of flatbread and handed it to Onan. As Tamar ate the treat, her smile widened. She looked at Karma. It's different. Karma grinned. It's almond. I mixed crushed almonds into it. We have some from the last caravan visit. Onan took 2 more helpings. Tamar urged Lena to try the spread. Lena nibbled carefully. She glanced at Karma. It's not that I don't like it. It's just, well, everything makes my stomach tumble lately. Here. She handed her bite to Onan. You eat it. Karma gave Tamar a knowing look. Tamar nodded. A week later, when Lena missed her monthly, she realized why she felt sick. Onan rejoiced with her. I pray for a healthy boy, he proclaimed, clapping. Catching Lena's scornful look, he retracted his statement. I mean, boy or girl, I pray it is healthy. That's when everything changed. The next day, Tamar had been sent to the stream by Lena to wash her clothes, and was instructed to bring water back with her in the large jug. Now that she was with child, she had even less ambition to help with household chores. Upon Tamar's return, she lay the clothes on a grassy slope to dry in the sun, then went to deliver the water jug. When approaching her tent, she heard talking. I saw you last night. It was Lena. What were you doing with her? What do you mean? Onan's voice. She went with you. What were you doing? Silence. Are you sleeping with her? A mumbled response. Tamar drew closer to the tent. You're sleeping with her? What? I said, Onan said. I said I don't see the problem. More mumbling. The sound of crashing objects emanated through the tent walls. The tent walls shuddered. How could you? You told me you were bringing me a maidservant. You said she was a gift for me, to make my life easier. Lena was weeping. Tamar rolled her eyes and strode purposefully into the tent. She saw the washing stand upended, Karma's and her own sleeping mats in disarray. What's this? Tamar said, turning to Onan. What did you tell her? Onan had the look of a disobedient child, the same look as when Shuda chided him for wearing a dirty tunic. Tamar wasn't one to take advantage of her position, but as it was, what position did she have? Evidently, only she and Onan knew she was his wife. A shout from across the tent gave Tamar a start. You! Tamar whirled around just as Lena sprang at her. She shielded her eyes from Lena's recently filed nails, but didn't escape a scratch down her face. Tamar grasped Lena's wrists and shoved her from her, holding her at arm's length. Lena twisted her arms in Tamar's grip. Let go! Tamar released Lena's arms with a rough thrust. Sit down, she ordered. Lena sat on her mattress, still fuming. Tamar reached up and wiped the blood from her cheek. A murmuring sound came from Onan, at this time seated beside Lena. He was petting her arm, looking at her beseechingly. She faced the other way. It doesn't matter, Tamar said, and stormed out of the tent. Later, as the sun was setting, Karma caught Tamar striding past the grouping of fig trees at the edge of the settlement, a cloth bundle and a small wooden chest in her arms. What? What happened? Karma said, reaching up and touching the scratch on Tamar's cheek. Tamar couldn't hold back her angry tears any longer. She had been betrayed. She was nothing but a servant in this household, a cheap concubine, a maid. She explained all to her friend. I'm leaving. I can't stay. It's no use, she said through her tears. Karma enveloped Tamar into her generous bosom and held her till she stopped heaving. But where would you go? It was true. She didn't have anywhere to go. She couldn't go back to Judah's tents and abandon her marriage vow. She couldn't go back home. Who would marry her now, having been wife to 2 men? She would have to return to Onan and Lena. No, not Lena. She would sleep outside if she had to. She wasn't going to be Lena's maid any more. Now that she knew what was going on, she was going to make a decision for herself, and it was to sleep somewhere else. Tamar found a place to sleep. The 4 shepherds Onan employed had their own tent, so she usurped her right as wife to the master and demanded they vacate. It was to be hers now. There was grumbling. They didn't want to sleep in the sheepfold and went to Onan to protest. Onan's solution was to erect a new tent for Tamar. She knew it was because Onan didn't want an uproar among the staff to reach Lena's knowledge. Additionally, Lena would have a strong opinion about Tamar getting her own tent, which she would voice, creating an uncomfortable situation for Onan. He avoided conflict at all costs and erected Tamar's tent in a hidden depression just beyond the fig trees. There was peace for the remainder of the dry season. Lena left Tamar alone and kept out of sight for the most part, carrying her baby in private. Onan hired a real maidservant to take over all the tasks Tamar used to do. What a fool she was, thinking she could ingratiate herself to Lena, all those chores she made her do. Her only friend now was Karma, who enjoyed her company and who was glad for her help in the food preparation. Eventually, Karma moved into Tamar's tent. They shared many pleasant evenings together, drinking tea and talking. Onan never came for Tamar again. The rainy season blasted in with thunder and unrelenting downpours. Onan and the shepherds lost several sheep one night. They slid on slick mud and drowned in the roaring stream. Onan fell in too and was brought back to the settlement by the shepherds, his head battered and bruised on the river stones. He was taken to his tent and tended by Lena. To her credit, she never left his side. Tamar sat in the opening of her tent a week later, watching dripping clouds making way for a setting sun, coloring the sky bold shades of orange. Perhaps tomorrow will be mild. Perhaps the rains are over. A cry of grief sounded from within the encampment. Karma hurried to see what it was and came back several moments later. She looked at Tamar, lips pressed together in a mournful expression. "Your husband is dead." Tamar didn't feel anything. Now the child will be an orphan. The next day, Lena started into labor and was delivered of a tiny daughter she named Juniper. She immediately relinquished the baby's care to her maidservant. Lena grudgingly took little Juniper to her breast every few hours, but left the servant to tend to her the rest of the time. A day later, during a break in the rain, Judah and his youngest son, Shelah, arrived on camels to dig a burial place for Onan's bones. The funeral pyre was a challenge, as most fuel was still damp. Thanks to one full day of sun, however, a great mound of sticks and camel chips was ignited, and Onan's body burned. Lena and Shua wailed all day long. Tamar felt she should grieve, but legally she was still just Er's widow, so she kept to the sidelines. Once the bones were gathered and placed into a wooden cask, the entire company made a procession to the grove of tamarisk trees between Onan and Judah's settlements. The men dug a hole next to Er's grave, and Judah gently placed the cask into it. Since marrying Onan and moving in with him, Tamar had never gone back to Judah's settlement. Onan and Lena went a few times, invited to supper, but Tamar had been excluded. At first she thought it was because of Shua's animosity toward her, but now she realized it was because Onan was trying to hide his marriage to her from Lena. Now, seeing her father-in-law again, Tamar's heart went out to him. No one should have to grieve the death of one child, let alone 2. After the ceremony, he approached her and placed an arm around her waist. "Daughter." Tamar turned and embraced him. "I'm sorry, Father. I'm sorry about Onan." "I am too." His voice broke, and he held his breath a moment, gaining composure. They started back for Onan's camp with the rest of the company. At length, Tamar said, "Will Lena go back to her people?" Judah nodded. "I think she will want to. They can help her raise the child." He spread his arms to encompass the pastures through which they walked, and the nearing encampment. "All this will belong to Juniper's husband when she marries." A long moment of silence stretched between them as they walked. Soon the tents were close by. "But till then," Judas said, continuing his train of thought, "Onan's flocks will come to our pastures, and his servants. You as well, you will come back." Tamar's heart quickened, and she tried to make a case for herself. "I would just be a burden to you. I will move back to Imnah and live as a widow in my father's house." Judah stopped walking and turned to face her. "That's not the problem. Is still without a successor. He has pastures and barley fields south of us. No, I have another son. He is a child. He's 14. He can marry in 2 years." Tamar considered this. By then she will be older than 20, too old for anyone else to want to marry. And to return to her father's house, to be dependent on him, was not something she wanted in his advancing years. "Is he okay with it?" she asked. "Shelah?" Judah said. "It's not really up to him, is it?" No, it wasn't up to Shelah, or her. Apparently, if Tamar was to be provided for in her older years, she would have to have a son to inherit Er's property. Instead of moving back home to be a burden to her aging parents, and even worse, to have no means of supporting herself once they passed on, she would have the advantage of a large estate, lands and fields and flocks. She had only to bear a son. Again, it was a man making decisions for her. But she would wait. She would live with her in-law family until Shelah is of age. Chapter 4. Shelah comes home. Tamar's one request upon moving back to Judah's settlement was to bring her own tent that Onan had made for her. It offered a refuge to her and Karma from Shua's irritability, and was a private place to think. Karma was determined to take over the cooking tent. Tamar, tired of her mother-in-law's tasteless meals, helped Karma formulate a plan. The next morning, Karma was helping Shua prepare breakfast, given the task of stirring the bland barley porridge that made up the bulk of the meal. Turning to Shua, Karma said, "Onan's shepherds were so pleased you kept them on." "What?" Shua said. "Onan's shepherds," Karma said. "They were afraid you would send them away." "Humph, as long as they earn their keep." "They are good workers," Karma said. "Onan always let them keep half of all the wool shorn to sell themselves and keep the money. It's how he paid them." She gave the porridge a stir. "They're glad the arrangement will continue." Shua stopped chopping leeks, her knife held in midair. "Half the wool?" "Half," Karma said. "Oh, no," Shua said. "My husband pays our shepherds 1/10 of the wool and charges them rent." "No," Karma said. "Onan never charged rent." Shua pressed her lips together. Her nostrils flared. "We'll see about that. They had better not expect that much pay from me." As Shua tromped to the tent opening, Karma called out, "Too bad you don't have time." Shua turned. "Time? What do you mean?" "Time to manage them." Karma waved a hand, indicating her work surface. "You have the cooking." "You do it," Shua said as she exited the tent, headed to the pastures. Karma smiled to herself. Later, she relayed the encounter to Tamar as she made ready for bed. Tamar clapped and said, "You crafty fox, our plan worked." "Right," Karma said. "She doesn't know Onan never paid them that much. I can tell you she will be busy watching every fleece and bag of wool and how they are distributed from now on." Karma laid out her sleeping mat and sat on it. "And now the cooking tent is mine." Tamar yawned and lay on her mat. "I'm so glad. I can't take another of her tasteless stews. And that porridge! Ugh!" The next 2 years passed in the monotonous rhythm of lambing, shearing, rain, and harvest. Tamar lived in an uneasy peace, determined to get along with her mother-in-law, biding her time till she could marry again. Shelah, who had been continuing his apprenticeship at the neighboring Zoab clan for those 2 years, returned home shortly after his 16th birthday. Shua waited for him, pacing back and forth along the property line. Tamar stepped out from behind the grinding stone just as Shelah appeared on the horizon and observed Shua trotting out to meet him, her headscarf flapping behind her. Shielding her eyes against the setting sun, Tamar could see Shua fussing over her youngest son, embracing him, and then grasping the bundle he carried and carrying it for him. When Mother Shua announced Shelah's arrival, he lowered his head, glancing around awkwardly. Tamar shot him a bemused smile. "Son, finally back with us!" It was Judah coming from behind Tamar to greet him. "You got my message?" The boy nodded. Judah paused next to Tamar and reached for her hands. She dusted the fine barley flour from them and allowed herself to be presented. Shua observed with arms crossed, her chin raised scornfully. "Remember Tamar?" Judah said. Shelah bowed. "You've grown," Tamar said. "I barely recognized you from when I first came to your father's tents." Shelah straightened and raked his fingers through his lustrous hair, away from eyes the color of ripened dates. He looked more like Shua than the other two sons, tall and lean, his barely there beard accentuating his fine features. "You've grown too," Shelah said. He looked to his mother, suddenly self-conscious. "Time for supper," Shua said briskly. Relieved, Shelah allowed his mother to lead him to the benches around the cooking fire. The rest followed after. Having been married to a warrior, virile and manly, and a sheep farmer who was also husband to another wife, Tamar had a hard time picturing herself wed to this boy, this child, and Shua didn't make it any easier with her constant fussing over his meals, which she prepared herself, and insisting he didn't work during the heat of the day lest he faint from exhaustion. Tamar wondered how he survived his apprenticeship to the metalworker at the neighbor's farm. She had her answer from Karma, who had connections among the service workers in other nearby clans. "He pleased the mistress," she said simply, with a raised eyebrow and a nod. "Oh," Tamar responded. "Humph, I'll bet Mother Shua doesn't know about that." "Yes," Karma said. "She had recently been widowed. I heard it from their cook." Having Shelah among them changed the whole atmosphere of the encampment. He had a good sense of humor and showed genuine interest in everyone around him. Shua was actually cheery, enjoying giving special treatment to her youngest son, who returned her attentions with affectionate remarks. "No one can cook like Mother," he would say, accepting a second helping of flatbread spread with herbed butter or a tender lamb cutlet, proof that Shua can cook a decent meal if she wanted to. Coming back from the pasture earlier than the rest of the workers, usually just as the sun was reaching its highest point overhead, Shelah made a habit of checking to see what Tamar was doing, sometimes helping her with the task. "Here, let me grind that barley," he would offer. "Don't let Mother Shua see you do that," Tamar said, relinquishing her seat at the grinding stone. "She'll say I'm making you work too hard." He tossed his fine head. "I worked much harder than that for the Zoab clan, and sometimes I helped Dara, that is, the master's wife, in the kitchen if I was done in the metal shop." "I thought her husband had passed on," Tamar said with a sly look his way. That's right, he did, last year." Shelah turned the grinding stone faster, it seemed. Tamar scooped up the fine barley flour that flew from between the two stones. "Hold on, I can't keep up." Shelah paused while Tamar mounded the flour into a finely woven basket. "That should do. I'll bring it to Karma in the food tent." Shelah accompanied Tamar on her way. Tamar stole a glance at him and admired how the sun played on his dark hair and how muscular he had become in the past months. He looked quite grown up now, and she felt a twinge of desire. Feeling her eyes on him, Shelah turned to her with a bemused smile and gave her a wink. Tamar's heart tumbled. Another year passed, and Tamar kept expecting Judah to bring up her wedding to Shelah. Her 21st birthday arrived without ceremony. Karma, of course, made something special, a flaky pastry filled with honey and crushed almonds, and gave it to her in secret. Tamar received it with a shriek of joy. "Oh, you remembered!" "Someone has to," Karma said. Tamar nibbled the delicate pastry and swiped at the drip of honey coursing down her chin. My mother always made me something special for my birthday. Mine too, Karma said. I grew up on the coast of the Great Sea where my father was a fisher. He usually found a pretty shell to give me on my birthday, and Mother cooked her special clam stew. It was my favorite. Are they still living? Tamar said. Karma shook her head. They both died when a plague struck our village. I've been working in service ever since. She drew back her blanket and crawled beneath it, tired from the daily workload, which had been increased today by making the special surprise for Tamar. How about you? How are your parents? They are both still living in Imna, Tamar said. Judah keeps me informed of their health and situation, as he travels there twice a year to help with lambing and shearing. I have a younger sister, too. She wondered if Bella was married yet. A tightness formed in her throat. Can't you visit? Karma said. Tamar lay down on her sleeping mat. I never asked to, and they never offered. I got a new family when I married It would be improper to pine for my parents. But I do miss them. Thank you for this, Tamar said, lifting the flaky pastry. She took another bite and carefully placed the rest into her wooden chest to enjoy the next day. Lying beneath her woolen blanket, she covered her head and allowed herself a short cry over missing her family. And the uncertainty of becoming Shallah's wife. Would it ever happen? She was getting older now. Would this young, handsome third son want her? And if not him, then who? Or would she, when finally able to return to her father's house, do so in disgrace, a widow with no prospects? The next day, as Tamar emerged to join the others around the cooking fire for the morning meal, Judah caught up and drew her aside between the tents. I'm glad we can talk privately. You see, there has been a development. Tamar raised her eyebrows, waiting. Judah clasped her hand and gazed at her sadly. Shallah's gone. A chill went through her. No, not... Judah opened his mouth, then closed it. He shook his head. No, it's not like that. He is well, and fit. So fit, in fact, that he has a child, a daughter. Tamar remained silent. She had started to become used to the idea of Shallah as her husband, her as his wife. Over the past year, he had grown more manly, more attractive. His flirty remarks and looks had not been lost to her, and she figured he just wanted to be a bit older before marrying. She felt a connection to him, who had been forced to leave his family while still young, like she had. Although knowing of his affair with his former master's wife, Tamar knew it was the way with young men to test their virility. Surely now that he was living among his own people, he would want to settle down and raise a family. She turned back to Judah. So where? When? He told his mother and I yesterday when he came back from a visit with the Zoab clan. The child is nearly a year old, a girl. Will he bring them back here? Tamar hoped not. It would be a slap in the face, a reminder of her own failure to produce a child. No, Judah said, his daughter will not become heir to his property until she is grown and married. For now, Shallah's flocks will combine with his wife's clan's sheep. Judah faltered. He looked down at his sandals and scuffed his foot in the dirt. Yes, he is marrying the woman today. Tamar reached out and touched his hand. Oh, Father. He glanced up at her, his eyes moist. I'm sorry, daughter. I have no sons left. Intermission. I hope you are enjoying Tamar by Silka Chambers. Please click the like button and subscribe to my channel, visiting often for more audio stories. We shall now continue with the story. Chapter 5. Tamar's Plan. A month passed, and Tamar formulated a plan, a last-ditch effort to secure her future. Her strategy required good timing and deception. Anxious, she needed a friend, someone who could trust to keep quiet. A couple days before the journey, she took Karma into her confidence. Enjoying a final cup of tea before going to bed, Tamar said to Karma, "I have a big favor to ask of you." Karma nodded. "Sure, what is it?" "That's the thing. I can't tell you." Karma raised her eyebrows. "I mean," Tamar said, "I can tell you it involves a day-long trip and a stay of about 3 days. You would have to trust me with the rest." Karma looked up to the tent roof, thinking, "Well, I can make a big pot of my lamb and rosemary stew. That would last the shepherds a few days. And isn't Judah gone to help your father with shearing in Imnah this week? At least I wouldn't have to feed him." Tamar smiled. "And that's the main reason I have to do this now. I knew I could count on you." She thought a moment. "What about Shua?" Shua had taken ill, having sustained a wound on her ankle which festered. She was rarely seen outside of the private tent she now inhabited. "Her maids will take care of her as usual," Karma said. "They won't notice us gone." Tamar and Karma were grateful for the mild spring weather as they left on their journey, laden with a basket of food and their sleeping mats tied in rolls. The day passed easily. Traipsing through green pastures and past barley fields ready for harvest, they arrived at Imnah just before sunset and acquired space on the second floor of a lodging house that first night. They lay close together on their sleeping mats. A woman nursing a child was lying on Tamar's other side. Karma had the advantage of being next to the wall. The other women and children in the room were mostly asleep by now, with the occasional cry of a baby or restless toddler breaking the peace. The men and older boys slept on the first floor. "Will you visit your father tomorrow?" Karma whispered. "There's no way I can, as much as I want to." Tamar's heart ached. As they approached her hometown earlier that evening, her heartbeat quickened and she felt a longing to see her old home, her parents, her sister. But it would ruin her plan. They can't know that she is here. "We came here so I can carry out my duty to Tamar said, "and to ensure my right to his wealth and property. After all, I was his wife." Karma raised an eyebrow. "So will you finally tell me your plan?" Tamar nodded. "Sure, my friend. But no matter what you think of it, I have to do this my way. It's up to me to work out my own future, and that is why we are here." She continued to explain her strategy to Karma. Tomorrow, after shearing was done for the day, she would go to her father's sheepfold in disguise. If her plan worked, she would be in a position to inherit all lands and flocks. If she failed, she would give up, return to her father's house in disgrace, and live out a meager existence as a widow 2 times over. The next morning, Tamar and Karma ate the fig cakes they had packed for breakfast, and then strolled to the marketplace looking for a special item. At a clothing booth, Tamar admired brightly colored gowns and matching headscarves and veils. Finding the ideal item to use as her disguise, she paid for it as the stall-minder tied it into a parcel with a length of string. As they perused other stalls at the market, Tamar glimpsed a young woman approaching out of the corner of her eye. She quickly ducked behind a tall stack of large baskets and pulled Karma down with her. "It's my sister, Bella," Tamar hissed. She peered around the baskets to observe her pick out an item to purchase. Remaining hidden, Tamar suppressed a sob. "Keep watch. Let me know when she leaves," she said to Karma. Karma stood up and casually sifted through the items for sale. Woven sleeping mats, belts, and more baskets, while keeping an eye on Bella. In a few moments, she returned to Tamar and nudged her with her foot. "She's gone," Karma whispered down to her. Tamar rose and looked around the tower of baskets behind her and across the road. The way was clear. She grasped Karma's hand and pulled her along an aisle among the stalls and away from the marketplace. Before long, they arrived back at the inn. At midday, it was deserted, most patrons returning at night to sleep. Tamar darted up to the upper room where they had placed their sleeping mats. Karma struggled up the final few rungs of the ladder. They sat down and unpacked the purchase, a linen gown in sky blue, complete with a headpiece that included a veil that would just leave the eyes exposed. As they admired the fine weave and subtle embroidery of the ensemble, a young lady burst into the room. It was Bella. Overcome, Tamar rushed to her sister and held her in a fierce embrace. Careful, Bella said, backing away. She brought out an infant from beneath her robe. Tamar clasped her hands together, her eyes glowing with joy. Oh, sister! The baby yawned and sucked its forefinger with rosebud lips. I knew it was you in the market, Bella said. How good to see you. You've become so old, Tamar said with a sad smile. She reached out and stroked the baby's cheek. I was going to say beautiful, Bella said. Tamar's smile brightened, and she quickly introduced Karma. What is this beauty's name? Karma asked. Bethany. The baby began rooting at Bella's breast. She lifted her tunic to allow her to nurse. What are you doing here, sister? You must come home. Mother and Father would be so happy. I was just going there myself. My husband was trying to help Father with the shearing, and we were to have supper together. Oh, Bella, Tamar said, a husband and child, how fortunate you are. She was torn. To see her parents again, and her new brother-in-law. How tempting it was, how she wanted it as a camel wants its fill of water after a week's walk in the desert. It had been so long since she felt the complete love of her parents, tasted her mother's food, laughed at her father's stories. Tamar hedged. Seeing her father again, and he being close friends with Judah, however, would jeopardize her plan. What if Judah was staying there? No, she had only one shot. It would be too risky. Tamar shook her head. I can't. You don't understand. I have a private reason to be here. You must not tell them you saw me. Promise. And with that, Tamar took Bella into her confidence and revealed her scheme. After listening in silence, Bella said, I can help you. She burped little Bethany and wrapped her more tightly in the blanket. Soon the baby was asleep. When you come to the sheepfold tonight, I can make sure Father and my husband come home in time. Sometimes they linger, drinking wine and talking till late at night. If I get them away, you can have privacy for, you know. Tamar smiled. That would help greatly. She turned to her friend. Wait for me here tonight. We must be ready to leave at daybreak. That evening, Tamar swept along the low stone wall of the sheepfold, her sky-blue gown fluttering against her legs. Shades of red and gold played on the walls of the enclosure as the sun descended over the coastal plain to the west. She had kept herself hidden as the sheep were fed and the sheepfold locked for the night. The shearing hut next door was filled with stacks of fleece, ready for processing. It was here she waited. Her heart beat faster and faster as she heard her father bid Judah goodbye around the other side of the building, and the cheerful sound of her sister's voice urging him to hurry home. Tamar was almost done in by hearing her father's voice. Raising her hand beneath the veil, she bit down on her fist, squeezing her eyes shut against tears that threatened. Soon she heard footsteps. It was Judah. I don't mind sleeping here tonight, he called out after Hira. Someone would have to guard the wool they worked so hard to harvest. Tamar darted a look at Judah as he approached. She slid out of the shadow of the building and gave him a nod with a raised eyebrow. She would have to give this all she had. Having most of her face concealed by the veil, she raised her eyes to look at him, fluttering her eyelids. She had used some cast-off cosmetics from Lena to accentuate her eyes, black outlines extending to wispy points. She nudged one sandal-shod foot from beneath her gown seductively to expose her ankle. Judah murmured, smiling broadly and sidling up to her. Tamar batted her eyelashes again and reached for his hand. Judah returned her grasp. Sir, what will you pay me? She spoke in a husky whisper. He thought a moment. A sheep? Or how about a goat? I will bring it to you here tomorrow. Tomorrow? He grinned at her foolishly. I can bring 2 of them if you will, again tomorrow night. Tamar lowered her eyes and stepped to the entry of the building. Thank you, sir. Just 1 will do. But to assure me you will indeed bring it tomorrow. She turned and touched the cord around his neck. Let me keep your signet. I will return it to you when I have your payment." Wordlessly, Judah removed the cord with the signet and handed it to her. She placed it around her neck. With a firm hand, she drew him into the shearing hut. It didn't take long. They tumbled onto the soft fleece and completed the act in a matter of moments. Judah lay on the wool-strewn floor, spent. Tamar arranged her clothes again, keeping behind the veil. Before Judah fell into a deep sleep, Tamar stepped away and said over her shoulder, "Till tomorrow," fingering the signet as she walked away. After the encounter with Judah at the shearing hut, Tamar hurried through the sleeping city, back to the inn. To avoid robbers that occupied the highways at night, she planned to leave early in the morning. A few hours of uneasy sleep, and she woke at first light. She folded the sky-blue gown and headpiece and, as Karma waited outside, bartered with the innkeeper to accept the expensive garments as payment for their 2 nights' stay. She didn't want to be caught in possession of the gown, lest Judah discover her deception. Eventually, it would come out, but she wanted to have the advantage of revealing all when it was her decision to do so. Tamar and Karma rushed back to the settlement and arrived by evening. They hadn't been missed. Tamar crawled onto her fleece mat in the tent and stashed the cord and signet in her wooden chest. As she lay on her mat, she relived the events of the past, was it only 3 days? Her monthly had been finished 10 days ago, and from what she knew about becoming with child, this encounter with Judah took place at an optimum time. She prayed her scheme was successful. Just accomplishing it filled her with more self-confidence than she had ever felt. She had planned and executed this all by herself. No man had any part in her decision. Her only regret was deceiving Judah in this manner. Judah, who was always kind to her, treating her as a friend would. Judah, who tried to make sure she was provided for, but who really had no control over what his grown sons would do. Drifting off to sleep, Tamar had dreams of Bella, little Bethany, and a nameless boy baby, her own. Judah arrived back at the settlement the following week. Shearing at Imnah was over, and he returned with several prize sheep and goats from Hira's flock as payment for his help. After finishing supper around the cooking fire, Judah remained seated while Karma and the servants returned to the cooking tent to clean up. He detained Tamar as she rose to leave. "Daughter, sit with me for a little bit." Tamar sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. A flutter of nervousness rose in her stomach. Did he know? "As you know," Judah said, "I was at Imnah last week." She nodded, holding her breath. "I saw your father." "Mm-hmm," Tamar murmured. "I told him of our predicament," Judah said, "you having lost 2 husbands and there being no other prospects for you here. Unless, of course, with Shelah?" He glanced at her quickly. She let out her breath in a heavy sigh and shook her head. "No, I won't do that again. He has a wife." Judah poked at the fire with a stick, sending up sparks. "I understand. I didn't think so." There was a silent moment. Then he looked back at her. "Do you want to move back to Imnah and live in your father's house?" Tamar's heart leapt. Her spirits sang. She could barely restrain herself from embracing him and clasped her hands together tightly. "Yes, I would like that very much." Judah smiled at the way her face glowed. She had never looked so happy. "I think it is the best solution," he said. "And you should go soon, in the next 2 or 3 days. Shelah will be coming to help with our shearing, and I don't think you want an encounter with him, right?" "Right." Standing, Judah said, "I will send a messenger to Imnah early tomorrow morning, so your father will expect you. Well, it was his idea you come back." Tamar rose and stood before Judah. She reached out and pressed his forearm. "Thank you, Father. You have always been kind to me." "And you to me," he said. "I will miss your gentle spirit." Chapter 6. Moving Back. Tamar and her retinue were close enough to Imnah for her to recognize the sheep pastures as those belonging to her father. She saw the stone monument signifying the beginning of his property, and the cluster of olive trees. She used to rest in their shade when visiting her father in the pastures as a little girl. She ate the last of the flaky pastry Karma had packed. Karma had decided to remain with Judah and continue cooking for him. Who knows, she said, winking to Tamar as she mounted her camel that morning. Shua won't hang on forever. Perhaps Judah will want another wife. This close to her hometown, and knowing this time would bring a reunion with her family, Tamar couldn't help but urge the camel driver to hurry along. Can't you get her to walk faster? She said. By the time the city walls were in view, she shielded her eyes with her hand and could see, incredibly, someone striding across the stony ground in her direction. It was a man. No, two people, her father and mother. Tamar ordered the camel driver to stop and jumped off before her mount was completely kneeled down. She raced to her parents and clutched them both in a tight embrace. Her mother, Tola, crying and petting Tamar's hair that had become loose from her headscarf, said, "When your father said you were coming back home, I was so happy I dropped the flatbread into the fire." Hira was laughing. "Yes, thanks to you, we have a new way to eat bread, seasoned with ashes." Tamar seized her parents' hands and pulled them toward the city. "I want to hear all about what's happening. How is Bella and her how is Bella doing? Is she married?" Tola whirled around to face her. "Yes, and she has a baby." "No," Tamar said. She started moving again, tugging at their hands. "Let's go see them." The three rushed through the streets of Imnah, pausing occasionally to rest Tola's legs. Soon they were home. Tamar burst inside to see Bella and her husband, holding the baby, seated on the woolen rug in the main room. Bella sprang up and darted to her sister, reaching for her hands. They laughed together and jumped up and down around the room. The husband approached, holding the baby. "Hello there, Bethany," Tamar said. Then, realizing her mistake, she glanced up quickly to see her mother look at her askance. Quickly, Bella jumped in and said, "This is my husband, Joel." Joel bowed his head to Tamar. Tola drew near. "How do you know?" "Mother," Bella said, "let's take out the spicy date cakes we made for Tamar." She bounded through the back door, dragging her mother with her. Soon they returned, carrying a platter laden with small rounds of flatbread, piled with chopped dates and honey, sprinkled with spices. Tamar sat on the rug next to her sister and sampled a cake. Her eyes lit up at the unusual flavors. "Where did you get these seasonings?" Bella chuckled and nodded toward Joel. "Ask him." "My father has a caravan business," Joel said. "He is able to obtain food and spices from as far as Egypt and Persia and beyond." The sisters continued lounging on the rug long after they finished eating. Bella nursed little Bethany as they caught up on events of the past 5 years, discussing who of their friends and relations had gotten married and who had children. As they talked, Bella suddenly stopped in mid-sentence. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Here we are talking about husbands and babies, and you—" "And I don't have either," Tamar said, lowering her eyes in a moment of self-pity. Just a moment. Then she looked up at her sister holding the sleeping baby, heard her mother whistling a happy tune as she made up a bed for her in a little used room, saw her father and Joel across the room, with heads together, discussing some important business dealing. And at that moment, Tamar felt blessed. She felt happy. "It doesn't matter." She reached for little Bethany and snuggled her in her arms. "I have all of you and my lovely niece. If God blesses me with a husband and children, I don't think I could be happier than I am right now, being home again." Tamar's stay with her parents was filled with gladness. Tola, happy she had a daughter back after having them both gone for a while, sang as she cooked with her together. Bella and Joel, who lived in a house of their own just up the street, often came to supper. Hira enjoyed the unique meals Tamar prepared, meals she learned to make when living with Karma. In addition to the pleasure of being with her family, before long, Tamar's joy doubled as she realized she was with child. Tamar woke from a nap in her downstairs room. It was a rainy afternoon, and, still drowsy, she lay back a few more minutes as the baby within her woke, informing her by a few well-aimed kicks at her ribcage. It had been 7 full moons since her encounter with Judah, and she carefully kept her secret hidden beneath the voluminous cloak she had taken to wearing during the cool, rainy season. She pulled it back and looked at her rounded belly, attempting to identify what body part was making a nudge here, a small protrusion there. At that moment, her mother entered past the separating curtain. "Tamar?" Tamar looked at her mother, mouth open, and quickly rearranged the folds of her cloak over her belly. "Oh, Tamar!" Tola spun on her heel to leave the room. "Wait!" Tamar called out. "I can explain." Tola turned back. She sat next to her daughter on the mat. Head lowered, she said, "Okay, let's hear it." Tamar took a deep breath and brought her mother up to date, beginning at Ur's death and ending with the thing that finally pushed her to taking destiny into her own hands, losing Shella as a potential husband, missing out on an inheritance that should be hers. Tola sat silently throughout the explanation. Tamar held her breath, not sure how her mother would respond. "Mother?" she said. Tola sighed and leaned forward, placing her arms around her daughter. Tamar held on tight. "I'm sorry, Mother," she said into her mother's headscarf. "I was out of options." Tola nodded and withdrew from Tamar. "Perhaps it is God's will," she said, giving a sad smile. "What will you do?" "I will have to tell Father and Judah," Tamar said, "but it worries me so." Averse to complex conflicts of any kind, Tola's solution was usually to put things off. She said, "You still have time." A week later, Tamar and her mother busied themselves preparing a special meal for the guest that was expected to arrive that evening. Supper would be shared with Judah, who was coming to help Hira with the early lambing. Hira and Joel sat on the wool rug discussing the purchase of additional pasture land as they waited for the women to bring in the food. Joel was a good son-in-law, but his skills were better highlighted in business transactions, having grown up helping his father with the caravan business. Judah's help would be much needed in this season. Tamar felt nervous knowing Judah would be at supper tonight. Maybe she would stay in her room, saying she didn't feel well. But Judah would want to see her, and her father would insist she come out for even a brief visit. She would just have to continue concealing her enlarged belly while he was here. A confrontation with him, and with her father present as well, was something she hoped to avoid. She wasn't quite ready yet. On the other hand, she must eventually reveal her condition to him. Judah would have to understand her child would be the successor to and be entitled to his wealth and property, providing her with a living as well. Indecisive, she donned her oversized cloak and stepped to the area behind the house where her mother was preparing the meal, taking shelter from the rain beneath the awning over the fire pit. Bella arrived with a basket of flatbread, her contribution. "I hope this is enough." Tola grasped the overflowing breadbasket, laughing. "This would feed the whole neighborhood. No wonder Joel's belly is getting fatter. You feed him too well." She placed it on the table in the small pantry room that opened to the back. Bella glanced at Tamar and winked. "His isn't the only belly that's growing. You must be due soon, sister." Tamar caught her breath. She glanced quickly through the back doorway to her father, deep in conversation with Joel. Voice lowered, she said, "I figure 1 more month at most. This baby wrestles so much within me, I think he's ready to emerge now." She ran a hand lovingly over her abdomen. "He?" Bella and Tola said in unison. Tamar shrugged a shoulder. Maybe. Judah told me once he can only produce sons." She continued preparing the fig spread by adding finely crushed almonds and a generous scoop of honey. Bella helped Tola add chopped garlic and onions to the lamb and barley stew. Tamar spooned the finished fig spread into a clay jar. She paused a moment, holding the spoon aloft. "I am worried about what Father will say." Bella stopped chopping garlic. "He doesn't know?" Tamar looked at her mother, who avoided her glance, then back at Bella. No, I was afraid to tell him, and he doesn't really notice anything unless it's in a bowl in front of him or has to do with sheep. I will have to tell him sooner or later, and Judah too, as having his child will entitle me to an inheritance. After a thought, she added casually, Maybe I'll bring it up tonight. Tola looked sidelong at Tamar. I'll have to stay out here to keep the fire burning. Bella grasped her mother's hand. Mother, Tamar will need both our support. I know you get nervous with things like this, but we have to be there for her. Tamar smiled gratefully at Bella. Their mother pressed her lips together, nodded, and returned to the cooking pot, stirring absently. As the women entered the house with the food, the front door opened and Judah entered, followed by his new wife, Karma. Tamar almost tripped over the edge of the rug in her hurry to greet her good friend. After the two women embraced, Karma looked meaningfully toward Tamar's belly and whispered, Looks like someone's growing. Tamar slid a look toward the rest of the company seated on the rug. She didn't expect Karma to come tonight and suddenly felt awkward at the thought of revealing her pregnancy with Judah's new wife present. Nonetheless, she was there when it happened and must realize he was responsible for the child growing within her. Shh, they don't all know, Tamar said as she took Karma's hand. They sat next to each other on the wool carpet, Judah on Karma's other side. Tamar carefully arranged the folds of her cloak in front of her. Judah greeted Tamar in his usual kind way. Being back home suits you, he said. You look very happy. Tamar averted her gaze. She felt a pang of remorse at how she had tricked him when he had been nothing but kind to her. It would be a mistake to reveal all now. How would he take it? Would it be asking too much of him to accept why she had done it? Judah began a conversation with Hira as he loaded his bowl with food. Joel joined in, and soon the men were laughing and talking all at once. Karma spoke in hushed tones to Tamar, describing Shua's last days, when the sickness made her leg turn black, and Shua became more and more incoherent, finally just not waking up one morning. After a suitable period of mourning, Judah took Karma as his new wife, and they were both very happy together. He is a kind man, Tamar said. He deserves a kind wife. Just then she took a rapid inhale, her hand stealing to her abdomen. A kick at my ribs, she said to Karma. Karma chuckled. She returned to her meal, scooping up a bite of stew on her wedge of flatbread. Tamar barely heard any of the conversation at supper and just nibbled at her food. Her heart beat so hard, she thought surely everyone could hear it sounding through her chest. Her answers to her one-time father-in-law were stilted as she fidgeted with her cloak. During tea and pastries, when everyone was quiet in the after-supper lull, stomachs content and minds at peace, Tamar wondered, should she say something now? Everyone was happy and satisfied. Why bring it up? Why not just let it be revealed naturally, in a month or so, when the baby is ready to emerge? The joy of a new birth may mitigate the dishonor of having no husband. Putting it off would be so much easier. Bella reached for her hand and gave it a squeeze. Tamar glanced sidelong at her sister. You can do this, Bella murmured. Tamar smiled. She turned to look at Karma on her other side. Karma gazed at her and simply nodded. How fortunate Tamar was that she could count on these two women to support her if she decided to reveal it tonight. If she decided. All her decisions had been made for her by the men in her life, but this child was a result of her planning, and the timing of revealing it must be her decision. Yes, it would be tonight. Tamar nodded to her sister and cleared her throat. The men looked up. Tola gazed around the company, ready to flee. I have an announcement, Tamar began. She held the eyes of all present. May as well just out with it. I am with child. There, she said it. It dropped among the company like a rock. With child? Hira glanced at Tamar, then at Tola, who was looking down at her cup. Tola! She gave him a sheepish look. You knew? She dropped her gaze. Daughter, Judah said. Who? Karma started talking to Judah, her hand gripping his arm. Bella began speaking out in her sister's defense. Hira held out a hand. Quiet, he said, standing up. Tamar, leave us. Go to your room and remain there. We will discuss what is to be done. Tamar stood up with difficulty and faced her father, who was gazing at her oversized belly, his eyes getting darker as he took in what should have been obvious to him long before now. Father, I have done nothing wrong. He seized her arm. Nothing wrong, and you, he directed this to his wife. You knew. It is a disgrace to our family, and in front of my guests, no less. And with that, he shoved Tamar toward her sleeping room. Tola fled out the back door. Bella sprang up and followed her sister. Hira spun toward the rest of the company, still seated on the rug. Joel, go get your wife. Joel waved a hand and said half-heartedly, Bella, come back. Please sit down. Bella glanced back over her shoulder and then continued after Tamar. The two entered her room and sat on her sleeping mat. Bella reached for her sister. Tamar was busy, however. She was rummaging in her wooden chest of belongings. The sound of arguing and her father's angry voice emanated past the separating curtain. Here it is, she said, drawing a leather cord from the chest. She lifted it up, revealing the heavy stone signet. My insurance. She turned to her sister. Help me up. Bella helped her to stand. Tamar strode back into the main room and stood facing the group, her sister at her side. Judah was saying something to Karma, and Joel called out to his wife. Hira once again got up, righteous anger in his eyes. I said to... Tamar avoided her father's grasp and quickly brought out the signet on the cord, holding it up and letting it dangle from her fingers. By the man, she stated loudly. All became quiet. By the man who owns this, I am with child. Hira snatched the cord from her hand. Whose is this? He said to her. She glanced down at Judah, who was looking at her, his mouth agape. Hira handed the cord to Judah. This is yours? Judah nodded slowly. He gazed up at Tamar. When? How? Tamar knelt before Judah. Last season, during shearing. Judah shook his head and gave a questioning look. In the shearing hut? Judah's eyes got big. The harlot? He let slip. He glanced quickly at Karma. Karma nodded at him, her lips pressed together. Bella sat down next to Joel, who was gazing at the unfolding drama without understanding anything. Hira returned to his place on the carpet in moody silence. Tola peered in through the back door. Tamar bowed her head to her father. I am sorry. She looked back at Judah. And I am sorry to you too. But it was the only way. Is it because of Shelah? Judah said. Tamar thought for a moment. Yes and no. Yes, because he took another wife. And no, because you offered me to be his second wife, but I couldn't do that again. I felt this was the only way to fulfill my duty to and raise up to him a successor. It was my obligation and my right. Judah's face fell. He lay a hand on Tamar's arm. You have been more righteous than I. I should not have allowed Shelah to marry that other woman. It should have been you. I have failed in my duty to you and to Chapter 7. Deliverance. 2 weeks later, Tamar woke to a terrific urge to use the night pot. As she rose from her sleeping mat, a warm liquid ran down her legs. She reached beneath her gown and felt the slippery fluid. Sitting on the night pot, her belly grew rigid and a sudden pain gripped around her lower back. She bit down on her fist to keep from crying out. As the pressure subsided, she finished attending to her personal needs. Looking up, she saw her mother standing in the doorway, her concerned face illuminated by the light of the moon. I think it's time, Tamar said. She pointed at the puddle next to her bed. Tola knelt before Tamar. How strong are the birth pangs? I had one just now, I think. My belly got tight and there was a sharp pain in my back. I'll be back with some towels. Let me know if you have another pain, her mother said. By the time Tola returned with the towels, Tamar had another pain. Tola wiped the floor dry and helped her get comfortable beneath the blanket. When they get close together, we will summon the midwife. Try to rest a little. Tola lay down next to her daughter and stroked her hair. The birthing pangs continued into the early morning, several more times waking Tamar from sleep. Tola remained awake and rubbed her back whenever the pains started. A particularly severe pain caused Tamar to cry out, and her father rushed into the room. "What's this?" he said, rubbing his eyes. "Is it time?" Tamar nodded. She stood up and turned her husband around to the door. "Send word to the midwife." A moment after he left, Bella came rushing into the room. "We were coming to breakfast and ran into Father. He said it was time, so I sent Joel with him to get the midwife." She jiggled her baby in her arms. At that moment, Tamar curled into a ball on the mat and wailed loudly. Tola rubbed her lower back. Bella leaned down and peered into her face. "Oh, this part is no fun, but there's a great reward at the end. Keep thinking about that." As the birth pangs got closer and closer, the midwife finally arrived, briskly shooing the men out of the house. "We need water. You," she pointed at Bella. "Bring some warm water." She then instructed Tamar and Tola to assume the proper birthing position, Tamar squatting and Tola standing and supporting her under the arms. The midwife reached beneath Tamar quickly to determine the progression of birthing. Withdrawing her hand, she said, "I can feel the head. It's in a good position." She placed her hands firmly on Tamar's shoulders and looked into her eyes. "You will have to start pushing when the pains come." Just then, another pain started, and Tamar reached up and grasped around her mother's waist. Tola held beneath her shoulders to support her. "Push!" Tola and the midwife said in unison. Tamar pushed. The pains came one after another now, and with each one she pushed. The midwife sat on the ground and watched for the baby to emerge. It happened with the next push, and she caught it as it slid out. "A boy!" she shouted. The afterbirth passed. Tamar lay back on her mat and watched her baby through exhausted eyes. Bella helped wash the slick blood from the baby's skin as he wailed his discomfiture. He was soon swaddled tightly in a soft wool blanket, quietly blinking around the room, taking it all in. Tamar was just reaching for him when she felt her belly go rigid again. She cried out and struggled off the mat into a squatting position again. "It's coming again!" She bore down through another birth pang. Tola held her as the midwife watched beneath her. Incredibly, another baby boy emerged. "Twins!" Tola and her daughters were all crying and laughing at once. Hira and Joel rushed through the doorway and gazed at the identical baby bundles lying on the sleeping mat, their sweet faces exposed to the wonderment of the men. Judah and Karma arrived a week later to meet Perez and Zerah, the twin sons of Tamar. Dark-haired and dark-eyed, they were copies of each other. Perez, however, was the more active, greedily nursing Tamar almost dry before she could feed Zerah. Even at this young age, Zerah was content to sleep long hours or lie swaddled watching a beam of sunlight through the window. Once they were weaned, Tamar went to live in Judah's tent settlement in Chezib. Bella and Joel visited often, as little Bethany enjoyed playtime with her cousins. Even Shelah and his young daughters spent time with Tamar and her boys. Onan's wife, Lena, and her daughter, Juniper, never reappeared. Having put her toddlers to bed, Tamar sat beside the dying cooking fire to enjoy a few peaceful moments at the end of the day. Judah joined her there. "Tamar?" She reached out and touched his hand. "I want you to know I understand why you did it," he said. Quietly, he added, "I suppose you felt desperate." She lowered her gaze. "Yes, I did." "You did right by your husband He has an heir now, in Zerah, the eldest. And Perez will get his portion of my estate when he is of age," Judah said. He turned to her and smiled. "I told you I can only have sons. And because of you, God replaced the two that I lost." "And he has filled my heart with joy," Tamar said. A silence stretched between them, both lost in thought. Eventually, Judah said, "I hope you know you are welcome to remain here, even after they are grown, or you may go to live with either of them." Tamar considered this. She liked living with gentle Judah and Karma, her good friend, and it would be years before she had to think about it. Judah squeezed her hand. "In any case, it's your decision." Tamar smiled. Her decision, her choice, not just because Judah declared it, but because it truly was. She looked into his eyes with a heart full of gratitude. "Thank you." Epilogue. Tamar and Judah's son, Perez, was the ancestor of Boaz, who was the great-grandfather of King David. 28 generations later, Jesus was born into the family. Read Matthew 1, verses 1 through 17. Please read Genesis chapter 38 for the biblical version of this story. Thank you for listening to Tamar by Silka Chambers. Please subscribe to my channel and visit often for other audio stories. Visit my website at storiesthatinspire.com for short stories and books in paperback and ebook versions.